Captain Card, officers and sailors of the USS Abraham Lincoln, my fellow Americans, major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.
May 1, 2003 looked like an ending written in advance. On the deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln, George W. Bush announced that major combat operations in Iraq had ended, and the image carried exactly the kind of certainty the campaign had been built to project. Baghdad had fallen. Saddam Hussein's regime had collapsed. American armor had crossed Iraq in weeks. Night strikes, rolling columns, and the seizure of the capital had compressed the war into a sequence of pictures that felt almost too clean for something so violent. From far away, it looked like a modern campaign delivered at full speed, a superpower striking hard, moving fast, and reaching its objective before the world had fully absorbed what had happened. The message was simple enough to fit into a single frame. The hard part was over. The dangerous part had passed. The war had been won in the same shape it had been sold. That image lasted because it turned a complicated invasion into a story anybody could understand at a glance. A dictator had been toppled. A capital had been taken. The campaign looked precise, overwhelming, and disciplined, the kind of war planners imagine when they talk about momentum, dominance, and shock. Yet the power of the image also hid the weakness beneath it. Iraq had been crossed faster than it had been secured. A regime had been broken faster than a replacement order could be built. The capital had fallen before the state behind it had been steadied, and that gap between battlefield victory and political control was already opening even as the carrier deck became the symbol of success. The campaign was not fake. The speed was not fake. What was false was the sense that speed itself had solved the larger problem. The invasion had reached its destination. Iraq itself had not settled into anything stable. To understand how the war earned that image, the story has to begin before the road north, before Baghdad airport, before the thunder runs, and before the statue in Firdos Square came crashing down. It begins in darkness, with a strike meant to hit the war at its head before the body could move. On the night of March 19, American aircraft attacked Dora farms outside Baghdad on intelligence that Saddam Hussein might be there. He survived, but the opening logic was unmistakable. Hit the regime hard enough at the top, move fast enough on the ground, and the rest may collapse before a longer war has time to form around it. The first blow was not only about killing a dictator. It was about compressing time, shrinking the campaign before it had fully begun, and forcing Iraq to collapse faster than history usually allows. That ambition sat inside the war from the first night. That was the war the United States thought it was beginning. Iraq was framed as a short campaign built on overwhelming joint force, precision attack, and a rapid drive on the capital. Baghdad sat at the center of that vision like a finish line already waiting on the horizon. Take the city, break the regime, and the campaign would prove itself to the world in one clean sequence. Success could be measured in miles gained, bridges crossed, roads secured, and days shaved off the march north. In that kind of war, speed did more than help the offensive. Speed became its public argument. Every hour the columns kept moving made the invasion look stronger, smarter, and more inevitable. The campaign would spend the next several weeks proving that it could move with astonishing pace. It would spend the years after that revealing how much had been hidden behind that pace from the beginning.
The waiting is over. The war on Saddam has begun.
Because we're all being told to evacuate this hotel immediately. We'll talk to you later.
We'll finish that. Saddam himself the target as war begins. Gas alerts in Kuwait as Iraq responds with Scud missiles. America and Britain promise it's only the beginning.
We've been left with no option but to use force.
When the ground war began on March 20th, the invasion moved with the confidence of a force built for speed and fed by a system large enough to sustain it. Coalition columns crossed from Kuwait into southern Iraq while a massive support structure kept the forward edge alive. Air power opened routes, struck command targets, and kept pressure on Iraqi positions before ground forces reached them. Engineers handled crossings and mobility problems that could have stalled the advance at critical points. Reconnaissance aircraft watched roads, compounds, and formations ahead, turning the battlefield into a constantly updated stream of information. Fuel, ammunition, communications, repair crews, medical teams, and logistics convoys all moved behind the spearhead, creating the hidden machinery that made the visible machinery look so smooth. The road to Baghdad was never just a story of tanks and Marines pushing north through dust. It was a story of a giant system trying to make momentum feel natural, almost inevitable, even though every mile depended on timing, supply, and coordination holding together under real pressure. From a distance, those first days could look almost effortless. On the ground, the campaign was packed with the old friction that war never loses. Dust turned roads into guesswork and swallowed vehicles in long brown clouds. Heat built up inside steel hulls and across open desert approaches. Fuel became a daily discipline rather than a background fact. Bridges mattered. Choke points mattered. Navigation mattered. A single delay at the wrong crossing could send tension through the whole timetable. The map on television looked clean, though the ground looked rough, wide, and full of places where momentum could be damaged or lost. That contrast helped define the opening war. In public, the invasion looked like a hard strike delivered with perfect confidence. At the front, it felt more like a gamble that had to keep paying off over and over again. Every day the column stayed on schedule made the campaign seem more certain than it really was while it was unfolding. Southern Iraq delivered the first reminders that a quick war could still turn vicious in an instant. Places like Nasiriyah became scenes of ambush, confusion, and brutal close fighting as coalition forces pushed through urban ground that could not simply be skipped without risk. The opening advance was built around movement, though movement in Iraq had to pass through towns, over rivers, and across roads that could turn into traps. Resistance in the south did not stop the campaign, but it stripped away the illusion that speed meant ease. The invasion stayed fast because it survived those shocks, not because it floated above them. That distinction matters. The campaign gained its confidence by pushing through danger rather than avoiding it. Each hard crossing that held together made the next stretch of road feel more possible. Each place that failed to stall the offensive added to the sense that Baghdad was now less a question of if than when. Momentum became a kind of pressure all its own, forcing the war to keep moving in the shape it had promised. Above that ground fight, the air campaign added another layer to the feeling that this was modern war delivered at full scale. Baghdad was hit by waves of strikes that lit the night sky and sent a message long before the capital itself was reached. Cruise missiles, aircraft, surveillance platforms, and support planes worked together to keep the regime under constant stress while the road north kept tightening. The language around it leaned on terms like precision and shock, words meant to suggest control, intelligence, and exactness. On the ground, those ideas translated into something simpler and harsher. Keep Iraqi defenses reacting. Keep command structures under strain. Keep the road open. Keep the capital under pressure before the columns arrive. By the end of those first days, the campaign had already established its rhythm. Strike at night. Advance by day. Absorb the friction. Keep moving. Baghdad was still ahead, though the shape of the war was already being fixed by the speed of the approach.
This is what it's like on the receiving end. Last night, a square mile in central Baghdad seemed like hell on earth. An inferno.
Even in those opening days, Iraq refused to behave like a single straight-line campaign. The public picture centered on the southern drive to Baghdad, though the wider war was already more fragmented than that image allowed. Turkey's refusal to provide the access Washington had hoped for forced the coalition to improvise in the north, turning what might have been a cleaner two-front pressure campaign into a patchwork of special operations work, Kurdish partnership, and delayed positioning. While the main advance drove up from Kuwait, the northern picture developed through a different rhythm entirely, one less visible on television and less simple on a briefing map. That mattered from the start. The war looked unified from far away, though on the ground it was already splitting into separate lanes, separate pressures, and separate local realities. Iraq was not opening as one battlefield. It was opening as several overlapping wars, all moving under the same banner, all heading toward the same capital, and all carrying their own risks. That wider shape came into clearer view on March 26, when paratroopers from the 173rd Airborne Brigade dropped into Basha Airfield near Erbil. The operation gave the coalition a foothold in the north and showed how quickly the war could shift from the neat language of planning into the rough work of adaptation. Kurdish fighters, American special operators, conventional forces arriving by air, and the main push still driving north from Kuwait all existed inside the same invasion, though they did not feel like the same war in the same moment. One part of Iraq was being reached through roads and armored columns. Another was being opened through airborne insertion and local alliances. That difference would matter more as the years went on, though even here it carried weight. The campaign had not been derailed by the loss of Turkish access. It had bent around it. That flexibility looked like strength, and in many ways it was. Still, it also showed that the clean public picture of the war was already beginning to fray under contact with the region itself. In the south, Basra offered another warning hidden inside the larger speed of the campaign. British forces moved against the city while trying to avoid turning it into a long and bloody urban trap, and that caution revealed a pressure sitting underneath the coalition's momentum. Major cities could not simply be treated like highway markers on the way to Baghdad. Each one raised the same ugly possibility. A force moving quickly across open ground could still lose time, men, and control the moment the war narrowed into streets, intersections, and neighborhoods. Basra was not Baghdad, though it forced the same hard question into view. How long could the coalition preserve the feeling of movement once the war stopped being about distance and started becoming about dense urban ground? Even while American forces kept pushing north, the presence of Basra in the southern picture hinted at what cities could do to timetables, confidence, and plans built around speed. Roads were still carrying the campaign forward, but the future of the war was already sitting in places where roads ended and streets began. Then came the sandstorms. Late in March, walls of dust rolled across parts of Iraq and slowed the offensive, wrapping columns in brown haze and briefly making the whole invasion feel exposed to something larger than enemy resistance alone. Vehicles vanished into blowing grit. Visibility collapsed. The desert itself seemed to push back against the timetable. Yet even that interruption did not break the campaign's rhythm for long. The drive paused, adjusted, and resumed, and in that pattern the real character of the invasion became easier to see. Push. Pause. Regain balance. Push again. Momentum was no longer just a byproduct of the war. It was becoming the war's central demand. Everything had to be fed back into it, whether the obstacle came from weather, resistance, broken routes, or the simple exhaustion of men and machines moving at relentless pace. By the time the dust cleared, Baghdad felt closer in every sense, not only because the columns had advanced, but because the war had shown it could absorb disruption without losing its shape.
It was darkness during the day brought on by sandstorms so thick they shut out the sun and slowed down the coalition drive for Baghdad. First sand, then slashing rain and sheets of lightning have left U.S. troops fighting not just the Iraqi soldiers, but also the forces of nature.
As coalition forces pushed deeper into central Iraq, the campaign tightened around a single question. How hard would Baghdad be to reach, and how hard would it be to crack once reached? The capital had lived in the American imagination for months as the place where the regime would either collapse or make it stand, and the ground south of the city now carried the weight of that expectation. The closer the columns came, the less Iraq looked like a vast battlefield and the more it narrowed into a final belt of approaches, river lines, roads, and defensive positions that had to be broken without letting the whole advance lose its pace. Baghdad was no longer a distant objective printed on maps and repeated in briefings. It was starting to become a physical presence at the end of the road, a city pulling the campaign toward itself while forcing every remaining mile to matter more than the last. That final approach was shaped by the ground itself. South and southwest of Baghdad, the Euphrates, the Lake Country, the Kabul corridor, and the western routes toward the capital turned the march north into a more dangerous kind of fight. Republican Guard units, though already under intense pressure, still represented the last serious conventional shield in front of the city. Air strikes hammered their positions. Ground forces kept closing the distance. The coalition could not afford to let the defense settle into a stronger, more coherent line, and that urgency gave the approach a sharper edge than the earlier movement through southern Iraq. The war was still moving fast, though now the speed had to survive against a defender positioned much closer to the capital it was meant to protect. Every broken formation, every forced withdrawal, every route kept open made Baghdad feel less like a looming challenge and more like a city being stripped of the space it needed to defend itself. By early April, the western edge of Baghdad had become the threshold that mattered most. American forces seized Baghdad International Airport on April 3 after hard fighting, and that changed the emotional balance of the campaign at once. The airport was not just another objective captured on the way north. It was the first real foothold at the edge of the capital, proof that the war had reached Baghdad in more than name. Runways, service roads, perimeter fences, overpasses, and open approaches around the airport now belonged to the fight. The city had shifted from abstract prize to tangible battlefield. What had seemed distant for weeks was suddenly close enough to touch, close enough to fire into, close enough to enter. The seizure of the airport made the campaign feel as though it had crossed from one kind of war into another. The road march had reached the rim of the capital, and everything after that point would be measured not in open miles but in the struggle to break the city itself. That victory on the western edge of Baghdad also revealed something crucial. Iraqi defenses there looked weaker and less coordinated than many had feared, and that opened the door to a riskier, faster decision. A long siege no longer seemed inevitable. A grinding block-by-block encirclement no longer felt like the only path. The chance was there to strike into Baghdad itself before the defenders could gather themselves, before the city could harden into a slower and uglier fight. That possibility changed the air around the campaign. Speed had carried the invasion from Kuwait to the edge of the capital. Now speed was being asked to do something even more dramatic. It was being asked to survive contact with the city that had defined the whole war from the beginning. Baghdad was no longer waiting at the end of the road. It was beginning to pull the campaign inside. On April 5, that chance turned into movement. American armor launched the first Thunder run into Baghdad, driving up Highway 8 in a fast, violent reconnaissance in force that cut through the western side of the city and forced a question nobody could answer from a map. Could Baghdad actually be entered, crossed, and survived before its defenders found a way to close around the road? The answer came in steel and speed. Abrams tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles pushed through gunfire, smoke, confusion, and broken intersections while Iraqi forces tried to hit them from the flanks, from overpasses, and from pockets of resistance scattered along the route. It was not a clean ride and it was not meant to be one. The point was to test the capital under stress, to find out whether Baghdad was still a city waiting to swallow an attacker or whether its outer defenses were already too weak and too disjointed to stop a hard thrust through its heart. What mattered most about that first run was not how much ground it held by the end of the day. What mattered was what it proved. Baghdad could be entered. The city could be hit at speed. Its western defenses could not seal the roads fast enough to stop armored columns from cutting deep into the capital and getting back out. That changed the emotional weight of the whole campaign. For weeks, Baghdad had existed as the final test, the place where the war might slow, harden, and turn into something much uglier. After April 5th, the city looked different. It looked vulnerable. Its image as an untouchable final fortress began to crack under the sight of American armor moving through it in broad daylight. That was the deeper shock of the first Thunder run. It did not simply wound the defense. It wounded the idea that Baghdad could still dictate the pace of the war. Once that was clear, hesitation became dangerous. A city that had been tested and found open could not be left alone for long without giving the defense time to recover, regroup, and turn fear back into structure. The campaign had moved too fast for too many days to suddenly choose caution at the edge of the prize it had been built around. The logic of the war, the same logic that had driven the columns out of Kuwait and through southern Iraq, now demanded another leap. American commanders had to decide whether to pause and risk letting Baghdad gather itself or go back in with the intention of holding the regime's center. The answer was shaped by everything that had come before it. Speed had brought the invasion to the capital. Speed had punched through the airport threshold. Speed had now shown that Baghdad's arteries were open enough to take punishment from inside. The road north had become a road into the city, and once that happened the campaign was pulled toward a second, larger blow. 2 days later, on April 7th, that blow came. The second Thunder run drove deeper into Baghdad with a different purpose. This was no longer a test of whether the city could be penetrated. It was an assault aimed at taking and holding the regime district, the political core of Saddam Hussein's power inside the capital. American forces breached obstacles before dawn, pushed through fire and confusion, and drove into central Baghdad with enough force to seize the ground that mattered most. Then they stayed. That last part changed the meaning of everything. The first run had shown that Baghdad could be entered. The second showed that the regime's heart could be occupied. Once armored forces were dug into that center, the fight for the capital was no longer about whether the city might resist indefinitely. It was about how fast the defense would unravel around a foothold it could no longer throw back. Baghdad was still fighting, though the shape of the battle had changed for good. This was the moment when the opening campaign hardened into one of the most recognizable images of modern war. Tanks moved through broad avenues lined with palms, smoke drifted over government buildings, and tracer fire cut through the center of Baghdad as television crews tried to make sense of what they were seeing. American armor had not only reached the capital. It had forced its way into the political core of Saddam Hussein's state and stayed there long enough to prove that the city could no longer protect the regime behind it. The roads that had carried the invasion north from Kuwait had led straight into the heart of the capital, and once that happened the war lost the shape it had worn for weeks. Baghdad was no longer the objective waiting at the end of the map. Baghdad had become the battlefield itself, and the regime that had ruled Iraq through fear, spectacle, and force was now being broken in full view of the world. Even then, the city did not fall in one clean instant. Iraqi units still fought in pockets. Shots still rang out from hidden positions. Counterattacks still flared in bursts sharp enough to remind everyone that Baghdad was not simply being handed over. Yet the deeper structure of the defense was collapsing. The old order had begun to lose its rhythm. Command links were fraying. Organized resistance was giving way to smaller, more scattered attempts to slow what could no longer be stopped. That mattered as much as the armored advance itself. The battle for Baghdad was not won because every defender vanished. It was won because the regime could no longer hold the city together as a functioning center of power. Once its core had been pierced and occupied, the rest of the capital began to come apart around it. One war, the conventional fight against Saddam Hussein's state, was ending in real time. Another, harder to define and harder to see, was already beginning to stir underneath the collapse. By April 9th, coalition forces controlled Baghdad, and the image that traveled furthest was the toppling of Saddam Hussein's statue in Firdos Square. It was one of those scenes that seemed made for history the moment it happened. Cameras crowded in. A giant figure of the dictator tilted, strained, then came down before a mix of Iraqis and American troops. The meaning of the image was obvious enough to survive every argument that would come later. A ruler who had dominated Iraq for decades had fallen in bronze at the same moment his regime was falling in reality. For newspapers, for television, and for governments eager to tell the story in one clean line, the scene felt like the natural ending point of the campaign. The capital had fallen. The dictator's image had been pulled down. The world had its closing shot. In that moment, the war looked short enough to fit inside a single symbol. For a brief stretch, that feeling made sense. The regime's center was shattered. The capital that had dominated months of planning and weeks of fighting was in coalition hands. The columns that had driven up from Kuwait had reached the city everyone had been watching from the first night of bombing. If the war had only been a race to Baghdad, then the race was over. That is what gave those days their peculiar force. They felt like both a climax and a release, the sudden settling of weeks of speed into a single visible fact. Yet beneath that release sat something less stable. The city had been taken, though it had not been steadied. The state had been broken, though nothing solid had yet replaced it. The triumph was real. The collapse was real. So was the emptiness beginning to open behind both.
And good afternoon. This is a special programme from BBC News 24 with Peter Sissons and Liz Pike. We'll be bringing you the latest on the war in Iraq.
First, the headlines. American forces say they have entered the heart of Baghdad. They claim significant numbers of American troops are near the middle of the city.
The outskirts of the Iraqi capital have been pounded with coalition missiles and artillery.
Saddam Hussein's officials use police cars and pickup trucks to try to rally support in the city.
And defiance from the Iraqi information minister. He claims coalition troops have been expelled from Baghdad airport.
Then the ground under the victory image began to shift. Looting spread through Baghdad. Government buildings burned or were stripped bare. Ministries, offices, museums, and whole blocks took on the look of a city conquered faster than it had been secured. The regime had collapsed, though order had not rushed in to replace it. The old state had been smashed open, and in the hours after triumph the capital began to reveal how dangerous that emptiness could be. What had looked like a clean military finish line from a distance looked very different in the streets. The city was no longer only a symbol of success. It was becoming a place full of exposed buildings, broken authority, frightened civilians, and armed men trying to understand what came after a government disappeared. The same speed that had carried the invasion to Baghdad had left little time to steady the ground underneath it, and in that gap the first signs of a much longer struggle began to show themselves. That difference between capture and control would define everything that followed. A capital can fall in days while the country around it remains unsettled. A regime can collapse while power scatters into smaller, harder forms. Baghdad had been seized, but no new order strong enough to command the city had yet taken hold. The streets, the ministries, the police structures, the public spaces, the symbols of everyday authority, all of them had been thrown into uncertainty at once. Victory had removed the ruler without solving the question of rule. That was the deeper fracture hidden inside the speed of the campaign. The invasion had been built to destroy Saddam Hussein's regime with overwhelming force and relentless movement. It had done exactly that. What it had not done was answer what would rise in the space left behind, who would control the neighborhoods, who would protect the roads, who would guard the institutions, and who would be believed when they claimed to speak for the new Iraq. From far away, May 1st could still be framed as the end of major war. In one narrow sense, it was. The conventional campaign had succeeded. The capital had fallen. Saddam's government had lost its center. American columns had crossed Iraq in weeks and forced themselves into Baghdad with a speed few had expected. Yet the victory carried a false kind of closure. It invited the belief that the hardest part had already passed, that the destruction of the regime meant the larger problem of Iraq had been solved, that battlefield success and political control belonged to the same moment. They did not. The war had changed shape inside the victory itself. The roads that had carried the columns north now led into a country with a broken state, shaken cities, armed survivors, and a capital already beginning to slide out of the neat frame that had made the invasion look so complete. The fast war had been real. So had the illusion it created. So the opening invasion has to be held in two truths at once. It was a real military victory, fast, violent, and overwhelming enough to break Saddam Hussein's regime in a matter of weeks. It was also the beginning of a harder war hiding just beyond the moment of triumph. Baghdad fell quickly. Control did not. The columns that drove north had reached their objective, though the country they passed through had not yet settled into anything durable. One war ended in the capital, the war of highways, armored thrusts, regime targets, and collapsing divisions. Another was already taking shape in the spaces left behind, a war of broken authority, exposed cities, uncertain loyalties, and violence that would not wear the same face twice. The campaign that looked shortest from the carrier deck was only the opening stretch of something longer, stranger, and far less obedient to the plans that had sent it forward. If you made it all the way through, thank you for watching. The fall of Baghdad looked like the end of the story. In reality, it was only the beginning of a much longer war, and that is where this series is headed next. Stay tuned for episode 2. And if you want more war history on the channel right now, check out the Mogadishu video and the rest of our military coverage. There is plenty more here if this is your lane. I appreciate you being here, and I will see you in the next one.